Hi, Henrik. Thanks so much for joining me, friend.
Yeah, thank you. So good to be here.
So, I've, of course, been loving your writing, and there's so much to talk about there. I have so many questions, but as you know, I love to ask people about their life stories. And for me, this is really framing any particular interest that I have in someone or common area of overlap. Some questions is knowing the larger context of who they are and where they're coming from with their life and almost what their personality or their soul is like, how they understand themselves. And so I love to ask people about their life story and would love to start there if you're open and feel free to answer however you like.
Yeah, so that's always like an interesting question. I've always found it really hard to sort of explain myself and what I do and what I am. I mean, now it's sort of easier. I'm a writer and an essayist, but in some ways, I think maybe the best way to understand who I am is to sort of go back to my childhood. And so I grew up in Sweden in a small village on the sort of Baltic Sea coast of Sweden, with like 672 people. It's a very small, cute village. It was where my dad had grown up, and and I think I was very shaped by that space. It was, and in Sweden we have something called allemansrätten, which means you can walk wherever you want on like all farms, all forests. So it was a very like free range childhood where I was just like wandering in the woods a lot, and we'd find like old abandoned houses in the woods, and we had like a house in the woods where we like would pick up our computers, and we had built a film studio. And so it's this very kind of open-ended walks in the woods, and we had a boat, me and my friends, and we would go rowing in the archipelago. And so I was very shaped by that kind of open-ended, playful thing. And in some sense, I feel like I've just kind of stayed in that zone all of my life. There was like this point, like in middle school, when I noticed that all of my friends were changing, and there was something else kind of coming in with social games and status and people wanting to get laid. And I, of course, kind of was interested in one of those things, but I sort of stayed childish. Like I kept wanting to go into the woods and keep wanting to do those things. I was a little bit of an outsider there, but I see it as like a big strength that I just like never lost that childish, playful side. So it feels like everything I've been doing, or at least like the heart's work I've been doing, has kind of flown out of that place. So I remember like when I was maybe 11, we're still doing some like pretend play kind of things, and that kind of morphed into us making paintings of the things we were pretending, and then that morphed into making stop motion films, and then we got into like I was 12, 13, I got really into like Tarkovsky and Bergman and like art house cinema, and I started to write scripts, and then like now I'm a writer. It's everything is just a continuation of that kind of childish play that for some reason just kept going for me when it didn't for most of my friends. And so, like, that's maybe a weird way of framing like who I am, like, kind of jumps over all of that kind of career stuff. But it feels like the heart of me has been this kind of continual play. And now I live on a farm in the woods, and I go around like making music or reading books and writing, and just like trying to follow my curiosity. And of course now there's more care. I have kids, I have my wife, and that kind of brings another heaviness to the play, but it's still play to me in a way.
Hmm, what a beautiful answer. Do you have any memories from your childhood that were uh, sort of indicated early on what your personality was like or who you were or what you cared about?
Well, I have a strong one memory that I kind of is very fond of was that so this was like when I was starting to get interested in film. This was like in the pre-internet days. So I couldn't actually like see a lot of the films. So I would just go to the library and would read in the like encyclopedia, right? And I'd read a lot about like Andrei Tarkovsky, and read like this like 4 or 5 sentences about like Stalker or Solaris, and I'd be like so moved by that and like spend so much time trying to imagine what like a Soviet art house film looked like, and we were like walking and like trying to imagine that and like making my own like takes on that. Uh, I don't know if that's indicative of my personality, but that was like very much there's a certain magic in that kind of seclusion that came from living very far from the city and just being in that space of play where you get like these small signals from the outer world, but you kind of interpret them in this personal way. Um, so yeah.
You said that your life has been characterized by continuing to play even when some of your friends may have stopped or that shifted. Do you have a sense of why you kept playing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think um maybe I was just lucky to be in a place where I didn't fit in. Um, because so I mean I wasn't bullied or anything. I was accepted as a person. Like it was I liked the village, but I just didn't. Once you get to that age where people start to form more interest, and it's no longer play, there was no like natural place for me to go, so I had to turn inward, and that I think made me connect more to the play. I could imagine that if I'd lived in a city where it was easier to find peers and connections around my interests, I might have been more swept up in the status games within whatever interests I had. But because there was no status game or no like anything like that that I could join, I just didn't, and that maybe somehow protected my playfulness long enough that once because like once I was maybe it wasn't until I was maybe like 20 that I kind of entered the world where you had like a social status and a role, and I got swept up in that like everyone else for a few years. But I think at that time it was like so late that I had already kind of grounded myself in a way that made it so I quite rapidly kind of extracted myself from that space too because it felt wrong. Whereas I think a lot of the people that I knew in those spaces, so this was in when I was in the literary world in Sweden, most of my friends who I made in that space, they were still in that world. But I kind of probably maybe because I'd spent so much time alone, had a stronger sense of what I wanted to do and could see the distance between those things more well, and that made it easier for me to protect myself. That's just a guess, maybe.
Hmm. Hmm. What was motivating you at that time when you wanted to be a poet and you were engaged with the literary society?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of things. Some of the so like whenever you go become very ambitious, and so I was very ambitious in writing early on, and whenever you have that sort of drive, there's usually like a bunch of different drives and forces behind that, and some of those were, I think, very pure, play-like, connected to my sense of ethics, and some of them were a need for approval and to just like because I had been playing around with a lot of writing and art and film as a teenager, I was fairly well developed when once I got to a place where those skills were valued, that was an enormous relief. Like having been sort of an outsider and coming to a place where that this was actually like high status. I was making friends. I was people admired me. So there was obviously like a need therefore like an ego need and to get seen, to be somebody. So there's like a mix of these feelings that go into to any big drive like that, and then over time you kind of shed it and try to find your way down to the core thing, like the playful thing, the ethical thing, or whatever is the deeper drive. And I think I've sort of gradually removed most of those ego needs that also played a part early on. But writing in particular, it's interesting why I kind of, because there was this kind of unfolding through different interests. I was making film first and I was also making music. and from both of the I was sort of came from those two directions, film and music, and I guess there's a part of me that's kind of lazy because like if you make music, you have to have like a band and you have there's so much work to do, and I kind of felt like I could get to the core thing I want to do in just writing. So I can just take away the instruments and I can just take away the film camera and just keep the idea. And that really appealed to me because it meant I could move much more quickly and I was more attracted to, so I liked music, I liked film, but I was mostly attracted to like the core of the story or the core in the idea, and to just strip everything away and just get, it felt like I was getting so close to the pure thing and could move so rapidly when I stripped everything away to just the words. And there's something about words which is, it's such a strange art form because it's like you're weaving with pure thought almost. It's like in when you're making film, it's like you have pixels and you have sounds and you're mixing them together to create an impression. But when it's words, it's just you make marks on a page and someone reads them and that activates images in their head. So it's almost like you're weaving like cognition itself, and it's such a pure, like abstracted, cerebral type of art. And I think those things together that somehow made me kind of drawn to what it was like peeling away to the core with writing, I felt.
And what was happening in that chapter? What did focusing on poetry for a few years look like exactly?
So I got into it. Maybe the easiest way to tell the story is that I think I made a bet with a friend. So now I was 18, I moved away from home and with a friend, and we made a bet with each other that we would do a spoken word, go to an open mic and do spoken word. And I did it and he didn't. And then I was sort of discovered when I did that, it went much better than I thought. And that was sort of a ticket into a world of like spoken poetry and poetry slams and things like that. So I started in that space. And for a few years in the beginning, I basically didn't write, but I was just like walking around all the time and hearing these lines in my head, and I would like construct like long pieces in my head. So it was a lot of like walking around and doing that. And then there was these, and we would, meet other people in bookshops and bars. And I worked in a theater for a while. So it was these networks and scenes of people that we would just travel to different cities and we'd perform together and read. So it was a lot of it was kind of verbal poetry early on, and then sort of gradually. Um, but yeah, it became very obsessive for me. I was always going around like making up poems in my head, and then more and more just sitting and writing all the time. And yeah, it was a very, very strong sense of coming home in that format. Uh, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Um, what were your aesthetic sensibilities at that time? What made you proud of a poem or enjoy someone else's poem or dislike a poem?
I feel I mean, we're talking about between maybe 20 and 23 here. And so I was very much in the process of finding my voice. And I wouldn't say that I fully found my voice until my 30s.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think I definitely found like an important part of my voice in that time. And it was this sense of writing things that were, I had a mentor, Niklas Mesaros, who was a poet I admired a lot, and we started working together when I was 20 or 21, and and he had this fantastic ability to um, say things in a way that made it seem like it had never been said before. So could say quite commonplace things, but the image like that always came to my mind when I heard him read was looked like a fish jumped out of his mouth, and he was like really surprised. So he had this ability to just feel very surprised, and that ability of taking sort of everyday reality and transforming it into something that feels very new. Uh, was very attractive to me, and like as a sort of simplicity, but like with a lot of color and aliveness to it. That I found into early on, and I would say it's hard to talk about your own style, but I think it's an important part of what I try to do now as well, even though I've kind of woven in other things I weren't doing at the time. But that sort of feeling of not trying to be obscure, trying to be simple and talk about simple, normal things, but saying them in such a way that they sort of surprise you and make you see them anew. Um, I think so. Thomas Tranströmer, the Swedish poet, was also very important to me, and he still is like one of those poets that I read all the time. Still, I've been reading for 20 years, and he has also that ability to just like see reality with such fresh eyes. A lot of his poems are like I remember like when I first read his poems that they seemed like so symbolic and so deep and strange. But the more I've read him, I realize he's just writing his diary basically. There's a famous interview with him, or not famous, but it's an interview on Swedish television, I think, where an interviewer asks him about this poem, which is like a rather odd poem. It starts with a man who's shaving in the morning, and then the shaving machine turns into a helicopter, and he flies out across the fields. And Johnston just and then he asks like, well, where do you get an idea for something like that? And then he just says, yeah, well, I was shaving one morning, and the shaving machine it just felt like a helicopter to me. And when I looked out the window, it felt like I was flying. You know, he's just actually describing what he's seeing, but he's just such a sensitive, alive person to his reality that it becomes infused with this heightened aliveness that makes whenever I read his poems, I just feel like brought back to my senses and to what matters, and both to like reality but also to ethics. And but it's so simple. It's just basically a diary, but it's just so fresh that it becomes almost mystical.
How did that chapter end of being a poet and focusing on poetry?
That ended in 2013. So I was getting increasingly frustrated by that world because I was a big difference between then and now was that I was entering already existing scenes. So when I have the good thing about a blog, which was like the turning point for me, is that a blog is a sort of self-creating scene. You just start putting things out, and and a scene kind of gathers around it. And once you want to change, then the people who are no longer interested will just move away, and new people will join. But if you're performing in bars and in theaters, there's these already pre-existing expectations, and I increasingly felt like I had to conform to those expectations, and they had been maybe good constraints at some point allowing me to like push forward, but I was increasingly feeling like I could see this poem over here that I wanted to do, but when I took steps in that direction, like the audience would get bored or frustrated with me. um and like in particular, I was getting really interested in mathematics, and it was just no, you can't read like talk about mathematics in a bar with literary people. That you just won't take that. So there was like all of these things that were attracting me that I couldn't do, and I was frustrated with that because it was like home. And it was the first time I had like status, and uh, it was going well, and so it was painful to let go of that. I remember, so in 2013, I did a US tour with some other Swedish poets, and that was like a really big thing for me. It's not super common, like for as a poet to even tour at all, and so that was like a really cool experience to do that. But right around that time, I had also met my now wife Johanna, and And I just felt like so conflicted during that tour. I was not in a good place. I felt like this is so good, and everyone like this is like I'm finally sort of on the cusp of making it. I'm gonna be a writer. This is going to work, and still I feel all of this emotional pain in that situation that I was hard to articulate. And then when I met my wife and we started talking about it, and she is the cool thing about her is she does not at all care about status or those things at all. So when I talked to her, she was like, "But like, why would you stay? Because I mean, the reason to stay was like, I get money, I get status, I get all those things, but that didn't matter at all to her. She was like, why would you stay? Like, why would you do that? And then that helped me, I guess. It took some time to admit that I'm gonna have to give up this community and space where I felt like I belonged to find somewhere else where I can continue my play and the journey I'm on. But so that's how it kind of ended, and then I kind of went into my sort of internal exile where I spent 7 years just inward facing and not publishing or sharing anything I did for 7 years after that.
Mm-hmm. If you look back on that chapter of your life and your beginnings, your childhood, are there any questions that you understand now have been motivating you your whole life that are maybe coming out in your writing now, but that have been there all along?
That's a good question. I don't know what I've felt maybe the last 6 months is a sort of it's sort of like a classical thing, I guess, like a sort of hero's journey type thing. It felt like I was going out on a journey, trying to find something, and I really had this so strong urge to leave the village where I was from and to go out into the world. And I traveled a lot for many years, and I was in the US a lot, and I was in South America and all around Europe. And there was this enormous drive outward, and now, like over the last few years, when I've felt like I've really come home with like with my family and my writing and all these things, and I've met a lot of people through my writing and the blog, I've more and more come to realize, the classical thing is like the sort of answer was the place I came from, and that, how much of where I came from was right, and how much of that I didn't fully value in until I saw the other thing. When like once I'd seen like what a certain types of success could look like, what going to the big city could look like. I sort of turn back a lot and I kind of look at my grandfather and I look at my dad and I look at the village and my friends from back then and realize that a lot of who I am is very deeply ingrained in that. Um, and that's been a really sort of nice feeling. So turning back to that small life in a way. It's not really a question and answer, but it's that funny, very classical thing of like you're journeying out and the thing you're looking for is where you started.
Hmm. 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 I'd like to read a passage that there's so many wonderful passages in your writing, but this one, I have a few questions about this. You said, once I catch sight of a limitation and set to work overcoming it, I invariably say, I can't believe I didn't do this before. It feels so alive. That's how I felt when I noticed I wasn't a great listener and decided to practice. And it is what I felt when at 30 I admitted that I was, in many ways, a weak writer and chose to stare at that flaw. um, I'm so fascinated by that on multiple levels. What? what that process looked like for listening and what it looked like for writing for you and what this larger skill is, and of course also how that skill might uh, impact me if I were to practice it. But maybe to start, what was it like for you to do that with listening?
Yeah, that was funny because I was about to sort of pause you before you said
Oh,
that,
sure.
and no, and comment on the on how you listen because you listen very intently. It's very interesting to see to look at your face because you close your eyes, and after I've answered you, you seemingly are listening to how that kind of answer lands in your body and like what feelings and thoughts sort of bubble up inside of you. Is that what's happening?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so I don't know if I have much to teach you in
Oh, sure.
particular,
But I'd
but
be so curious to hear about what it was like for you.
so I grew up in a family where we really kind of are all very talkative and like break each other off all the time. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, but it makes you limited if that's the only way of interacting you have, because not all people are like that, and you're gonna talk over people. So I really had to learn to slow myself down, um, and that a lot of that work came with after I met my wife Johanna, and she is a really good listener and a very sort of thoughtful thinker. She likes to sit. Like sometimes she'll just stop in a conversation and be silent for like 3 minutes before she answers. Uh, and so there was a clash of those things, and it became obvious quite early on that I needed to work on this to provide space for her. And I remember I have a strong memory. This is more recently, but so she got into gardening once we bought the farm, and I have nothing against gardening in principle. I like beautiful gardens, but I'm not naturally interested in that, and so it was like a moment in our relationship where she was suddenly all only talking about plants, right? Like all the time talking about plants, and I just couldn't relate to that, and that was a sort of a challenge where I felt like, okay, I'm not. This is the person I love, and I need to provide space and I need to sort of feel in like what is she seeing here that I'm not. And then I remember I was kind of lying on the floor and she was talking about plants and I just locked my eyes and said, I'm not going to open my eyes. I told myself like until I understand what it is she's seeing here and just like really the slowing down and just hearing her. It's like and exactly what you're doing there and just slowing myself down enough so that like the words that are coming in really have time to land, but also that all the reactions that are activated inside of me have time to sort of percolate through my system. And once that happens, you obviously like I noticed that many of the things she's talking about plants, I don't actually understand. Like because when I'm listening rapidly and we're just talking, I don't notice that I don't understand it. I'm just like, oh, plants, you know. But once I slow down, it's like what is even a border and like I'm not sure if I know what like exactly how complementary colors work. Like I start to notice I'm actually quite confused about like a lot of the concepts and words that she's using, and once that slows down I can start to articulate like what does that mean, and then I'm connecting into my curiosity, um and also slowing down enough to actually sort of absorb, and that starts to change sort of my what I see and what I hear. So a lot of it is just this slowing down of the pace of the conversation enough so that I think a good conversation is in some way two people who are um reacting to each other. So I mean, not in this conversation, you're just asking me questions, but so you're asking me a question that's setting off some sort of reaction in me, and I'm trying to really feel that thing and what images and feelings and questions and confusions and or pains or whatever is coming up, and I'm trying to formulate that in a way that I can feed it back in the conversation so you can react to that. And you're trying to remove sort of the blockages that are keeping the flow of information going. And the blockages can be many things. It could be that you're not good at expressing yourself. So when you're trying to feed information back, you hurt the other person, so they block down, or it's because you don't give yourself enough time to process it. But I think about it a lot of like trying to sort of let the sort of process in me unfold fully and trying to give it back as much as possible into the conversation. So that yeah, I don't know.
Beautiful, beautiful. What a beautiful description of what that's like. Hmm. Yeah, and I was really struck by the phrasing of I decided to stare at that flaw with your writing. I think I have several questions here, but to start, how were you noticing there was a flaw in your writing? What was dissatisfactory about your own writing? What were you yearning for that wasn't there at that time?
So again, with these things, you need to slow down because usually there are when I'm in front of a text or I've written something, there is usually there might be these small subtle feelings in the body somewhere that yeah, oh, like that didn't feel really well, but it's very easy to sort of brush it off for various reasons, but you kind of slow down. It's like, why precisely didn't I feel like this opening wasn't good, or what about this image feels to me, right? And just slowing down and trying to like look at it closely and give that dissatisfaction time to sort of bloom into a more richly structured thing where it kind of more precisely pinpoints uh, the flaws in your writing, and it can be really hard. I've had a lot of help from my wife because she's not like an overly sensitive person in that way. She's we have a very open conversation where she'll point things out, and that can be also be very helpful to have someone who loves and trusts you enough that they're willing to point out those things that you might be shying away from. Because usually when she points something out, then I'm like, yeah, I know, like, but I thought maybe, maybe I could get away with it. And I think in particular around that time, so I'm always in this process of like trying to be sort of deliciously dissatisfied with my process, trying to be sort of um, enjoying my dissatisfaction, seeing that as a beautiful thing. Sometimes I'm just mad that it's bad, but a lot of the time I'm just seeing it as this source of insight. Um, so it's always going on. But I remember like a big thing. I think I can see a big thing that's changed in my writing is that I used to be when you're doing like when you're like a blogger, there's a strong incentive or like a strong expectation and norm around like that you're gonna have a big insight. And what you see happens a lot is that people come up with these new frameworks and they're this new way of thinking about it, which I don't think is that's like an ego thing. You want to have like a clever new insight. And I felt I was kind of doing that too much at some point, kind of had picked up that style of writing and it was hard and uncomfortable. How do you sort of push beyond trying to be insightful and like letting go of that ego thing and like writing, being okay with this writing the obvious things or writing things that people have already said, but maybe just adding your nuance or reacting to it without having to like be that cool guy who invented that new framework or whatever. So that was one of the things that I noticed, for example. Um, and then I mean, and then when you notice something like that, that's it's easy to say, but like, but how do you actually move beyond that? And that's a, like probably at least like for me at my like a pretty experienced writer, but even at my level, it's like a 18-month full-time kind of project to move through that and like build up a toolkit and the experience that you need to find alternative paths around the problem that you have. And if I look at my writing, it's hard to like reconstruct fully all the things I've been frustrated with over the last, say, 5 years. But um, I think the project, the like creative challenge I put myself was how to integrate. So I had my poetical years early on, and I felt I learned a lot of useful, beautiful things doing that. And then I had a few years where I was doing programming and mathematics, and I was really interested in science. So I have both of those sides, and those sides are really hard to mesh and make work together. And I guess the sort of the challenge I put myself was like, how can I find a voice and a form that allows me to bring in what I value from both of these sort of modes of thinking. Um, and so there's been this kind of gradual kind of tinkering with that design problem over the last 5 years. Um, and I can see the result of that process has been a more and more kind of relaxed integration of those things where I'm more and more those are the same thing. And it becomes also more and more personal. And I think that is to some extent how I think about the process of how to learn to write. It is you're constructing a style or a toolkit or a method of writing, and the goal is to construct a method of writing that is flexible and nuanced and well fitted enough that it can hold you. And so, like early on, I was picking up styles from other people and they could hold small parts of me, but I wanted to construct a style that could hold more of me. And I still can't hold all of me. There's still things I want to write about that just feel out of reach for me because my language won't hold it, or it, maybe I can write it, but it feels very different from what I'm doing now. So I'm always trying to sort of figure out like, okay, why can't I write about this, or why does this not sound the way I feel, and like always trying to learn new things, techniques, studying other writers, running experiments, and sort of gradually it's like the style is sort of a vehicle I'm building. And like the essays themselves, they are just the exhaust. The essays are just kind of the exhaust from the process. The actual work is constructing the vehicle that I can ride in language through my thoughts and my experiences, if that makes sense.
It's a good metaphor. How would you describe what skills you have cultivated since you decided to look at that flaw?
I think the important development is learning. I feel like more and more of my writing takes the shape of stories. That was like a mode of writing that I moved away from, and I was sort of bored by stories. And I, of course, I wanted to get to the ideas. But once I sort of started to reflect on like what ideas really matter and what kind of and when I realized like a lot of the ideas I was writing about was just ego stuff. I was just trying to sound smart. And once I kind of let go of that and started to ask myself like what ideas really matter. And then the problem, of course, is that they're hard to write about because they're so obvious in a sense. And there is a line Karl Ove Knausgård has a book called Inadvertent, where he talks about his writing, and he has this line where he says that literature is not about truth, but it's about creating a place where truth can play out. And so what that means, and that becomes really important because a lot of the important deep truths sound like platitudes when you say them. So you have to construct a space, a place, a context where that idea lands, where the reader sort of is ready to meet this and feel this alive and see this anew. And what I kind of realized was that I should turn back to story. So by telling things sort of obliquely in the shape of stories with like real breathing human beings, um, these ideas become embodied and alive. And that was sort of the way that I could write about these ideas that are like, if I were to summarize it as a classical blog post and like like they'd be sound really stupid and banal. But once you kind of tell it in with story, but my stories are not like typical stories. They're infused with a lot of things that I've learned from more classical essay writing and from blog posts. But I think that's been the big change of like trusting that stories and emotions and kind of trusting the spontaneous. It's this complex interaction between another metaphor I have for the type of writing I do today is like jazz improvisation. Um, is that I don't want to just uh, put unprocessed word vomits on the page. Like I do that in my journal. I want the thinking in my essays to be the best that I can, to the best of my ability. Things I've really processed, things that I've lived and that feel true to me and that I feel packaged in a good way. But I also need, because these ideas that have that character, that are that true to me, tend to be banal. It also has to have story, emotion, spontaneity. And so what that kind of ends up being is that I spend a lot of time reading, taking notes, talking to people, like like this conversation, like right now, I'm not repeating myself. I'm trying to process anew here. And this is like preparation in a sense for something. Some of the things I'm saying today might like end up in an essay later. So I'm processing again. It's like a jazz guitarist, like rehearsing, trying different frameworks, different metaphors, uh, critiquing myself, trying to make them hold and sound. And then, but then in the a moment of writing, I just try to let myself go by using sort of licks and chord progressions that I've processed through journaling and through writing, but trying to sort of find this weird mix of that you see in jazz. This is the weird mix of like really complex harmonics and rhythms, but that somehow manages to come out in an improvisational kind of playful way. And yeah, it's hard, really hard to express what that is, but
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you. I was really struck by a piece where you talked about um, I believe, mathematics text that I was not familiar with, Lakota's proofs and refutations. And you said that afterwards your thinking got more generative and structured from that process of analyzing that text. Could you describe what changed from that uh, study that you did?
Yes, so first of all, it's a good example of the last point I made. So I remember, I think I wrote, yeah, I published that essay you're referring to, which I think is called How to Think in Writing. Published that about a year ago. And I remember I tried to write it 1 year earlier still. And I was just like working through it. But that at that point, I was still learning and internalizing that materials. And I can't write. I need to let things live in my body for like a year before I can actually turn them into essays. But so at that time, so that has to be like 2 years ago, I came across this book, Proofs and Refutations. I think probably I stumbled across it through Michael Nielsen. So it's this wonderful, strange little book where Imre Lakatos, he was from Hungary. He was a philosopher and interested in mathematics and had a really deep understanding of mathematics. And he is trying to sort of reconstruct how mathematicians think when they are constructing new mathematics. Like where does new mathematical theorems and proofs come from? And how are they constructed? And the view he's sort of arguing against is that like a lot of people who have not done research mathematics, they sort of think you have these axioms and you can work upward in this very mechanical way. But that's not what happens. What happens is much more dreamlike in a sense that someone you state sort of some kind of mathematical problem, and in the process of this is so hard to express simply. Well, a simpler way that this loses some of the nuance, but part of it is a lot of mathematics is done almost like science, so that there's a problem and someone will say, "Oh, hi, I have a proof for that," and then someone else will say, "Well, there's a problem with that proof," and then you go and you make a new proof. Oh, there's a problem with that, and in that process of so you are articulating something and then critiquing it, like proof and refutation, right? So you're providing a proof and then you're refuting that and saying that proof doesn't hold. And in that process, you're forced to sort of create to so the first thing that happens is that like you start to surface more and more complexity from the problem. It might seem like a simple problem first, but then you start to think of edge cases, you start to think about ways that this doesn't hold up, and then you're forced to um maybe this is easier if we take just um more everyday examples. So let's say I come to you and I say that all good writing is just very spontaneous and you just have to bleed onto the page and it's going to be good like that, and then you come to me and say, well, what about Robert Caro's Lyndon B. Johnson biographies that he's been working on for 45 years and he's been like, and then oh yeah, and then you have to think of that maybe that first thing I said was wrong, or maybe the problem space was much more complex. And this is so hard to talk about, but you're surfacing more and more complexity by formulating a guess at what a solution could be. You 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 a beautiful metaphor that Lakatos uses is that he's saying you're trying to extend your proof. You're trying to um it's almost like the opposite of in a war. When you're in a war, you're trying to sort of concentrate and make your frontier impenetrable so you can't. But what he's saying, you're trying to extend the frontier so that there are more places you can attack. You're trying to make yourself maximally vulnerable. Um, and the whole point is like this process of articulating a thought invites critique and lets you see more and more of the problem domain. And what you realize it's much more complex. And once you have seen that wider complexity, there are a few things you can do. So either you go and say, well, I wasn't actually talking about, like, if you go back to my example, I said all good writing is spontaneous, and you say a counterexample to that, and then I say, oh no, I didn't mean all writing. I actually meant only personal essays. So that's one direction of just kind of shrinking the domain. Um, and then that's a fair enough a good way of doing it. But even more interesting is when you stop back and okay, now I'm confused because I have these examples of writing that is good because it's spontaneous, and I have these examples, and then you can try to step back. Okay, what's like another proof or another hypothesis that could explain both of these cases? What's the deeper pattern here? And then maybe I formulate that and I have another one that can explain both of these cases. And then you say, well, I have a third one, right? And it doesn't fit that one. And I'm like, oh, this is even stranger. And you're extracting even more complexity out of the main. And that kind of provides this kind of complex intellectual dance where by articulating, you invite complexity and counterexamples, and then you can this has gotten too complex already. But in Lakato's book, he shows these really wonderful, clever, beautiful ways of how you can deal with that situation. There are a myriad of different kind of mental moves you can make in when you formulate a hypothesis, it gets disproven, now you're confused. And when you're in that state, that's the state that he's exploring, and he has this very fine-tuned and rich description of various types of mental moves that mathematicians does in that situation, and how you can sort of creatively move through that confusion in such a way that you arrive at like deeper truths. Um, so it I can so yeah I can summarize it like simple, like there's the simple version, like articulate what you think and then invite critique and then improve your thinking, like that's a fairly standard way of thinking, and that's like the one sentence description of it, and I think a lot of people understand. But what that book does, which is I've I've struggled really much trying to explain here, is that it shows that the path onward is very richly structured. There are many ways of moving there, and there are some of those ways that are more powerful, and some of the more naive ways of moving forward are kind of limiting. But you'll have to read the book to get the full nuance. But it was really interesting to read that book really slowly and try to sort of articulate what that would mean in my context, in my essays, and trying out the various technique he has. It was like some kind of like mental heavy lifting of like building, and it comes back to the thing I said about style, because like a part of writing, so I'm talking about, it's like I'm constructing a vehicle for writing through experience and thought, and the output of that is writing, and part of that is just like learning grammar, learning techniques for how to construct an opening, but parts of it is also learning mental moves. And so I was, by reading that book, and I learned a bunch of subtle mental moves that made it more easy for me to, once I got into a corner, of finding creative ways of moving on, or using the problems that arose and the limitations in my kind of first explanations. So yeah, it's hard to, you had to be there.
Suggestive. I appreciate it. Uh, I'm reminded of something you said somewhere that stayed with me, where you said that something like, I worry that my friends who are writing very quickly and publishing very quickly are missing out on a chance to go deeper into their writing, and that there are doorways that are there that they might not even be going down. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so that was maybe a more succinct way of saying what I I tried to say there. It's yeah, exactly. Like so you when you go and sort of bleed onto the page, you are creating all sorts of doors. That's one way of thinking about what happens because your first um, description of something is going to be wrong in all sorts of ways, and 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 um, and the real kind of writing, the real thinking happens when you notice the ways you're wrong and go and open those doors. So like the first draft is just like a construction of a series of doors. And I think a lot of people just write that draft and then they publish it and move on. And it's like, no, you're supposed to open all the doors that you created in this draft. And that's uh where it's going to be interesting because I read these drafts and I see like, oh, there you're kind of asking a really interesting question, but you're not answering that question, and the thing you're saying here is actually in contradiction to the thing you're saying over here, but you're not resolving that contradiction. And I think that a lot of interesting things would have happened if you'd try to wrestle with the fact that these two things you're saying doesn't add up, and so on. Like all of these flaws or ways that things does not add up, or ways or I read something and I can think of like five counterexamples, and those and that's really interesting, right? So but the writer should maybe have tried to surface those counterexamples and use that as an opportunity to move deeper into their thoughts. Um, so yeah, a lot of like drafting, a lot of writing, it's that process of just putting things on paper and then looking at them or having other people look at them and like noticing the flaws because and that's the doors that opens to like deeper understanding. And it's such a fascinating thing because they're hard to spot these doors. Like I was one of the practices I'm doing right now is that I'm going around and I'm trying to do like verbal still lives, right? Like I'm trying to paint what I'm seeing, like in the garden, for example, in words and trying to accurately describe it. And it's surprisingly hard because you look at it, oh, it's an apple tree, and it's and then you try to write it out like what's the color? It's green. Like it's not green. That's not exactly right. What's the real color? Oh, it's bleak green. But no, that's wrong because bleak, that sounds like it's been bleached by the sun, and it's April, so the leaves have not been bleached. So it's not bleached green. What's the color here actually? And just like standing there and trying to just name the right color for the leaves of the apple tree will force you to look at it and you realize maybe you don't even have a word for that, and you might have to sort of construct like a metaphor to describe the color of the leaves. But it will but it to me that really opens the door. And like and once I when I do that and I'll go up close and oh, I like the leaves. The reason they look so strange is that they're actually light green, but they have these white hairs on them, which is creating this kind of strange effect that make them kind of bleached, kind of silvery thing. But if I look closer, I realize it's actually the white hairs on the leaf that is creating this effect. And now I can sort of describe it more fully. But it was my first bad description where I said like the tree is bleached green. That was a door. Right. And once I like, no, that's not right. And I start looking and I start surfacing more complexity. Then I start to see the hair, the white hair on the leaves, and I start to see like the way the leaves sit together around the flowering buds, and it looks like an octopus almost. Like it's so much realness and so much aliveness there, and looking up close and really seeing on apple bud, and it's nothing at all like I would imagine that it was. And I think that's the sort of thing I'm going for. It's like becoming aware of how little I see and using that awareness as a door to see more and live like. And it's so fun, just to see how beautiful the tree is, and there's so much more there, and you just take it for granted. It's just been in my farm for 4 years, and I thought I'd seen it, and I hadn't. And everything is like that. Everything is like unseen.
Hmm. Do you have a sense of something that if you wrote it in the future would make you very proud? That you'd be like, ah, I've really accomplished something. I'm really proud of what I wrote, what that might look like or feel like, or what qualities it would have.
That's a good question. As I said earlier, that I view essays as these rooms that you enter, which are a place for truth, for like, or a place where you're sort of constructing a room of words that are provoking various emotional and intellectual reactions in the reader. And it would be really fun at some point to be able to do that at book length. Could I create a space that you could be inside for 10 hours, and it would be, and how deep could you make that experience? Like how what kind of, because right now I'm doing things that are like 20 minutes long, but if I did something that was 10 hours long, what kind of experiences could I guide the reader into feeling and realizing, and me too in the process of writing it. I just don't feel I have the skill to maintain and deepen a narrative for that long, but that's something I'd love to do. Also, there's some, maybe that's vanity, but there's some pleasure, like some kind of writerly pressure, writerly pride in trying to do that kind of thing with less. So it feels like a lot of the really best writers, they'll just write a book about someone, walking around in their neighborhood. And then that's all there is, like someone walking around looking at trees, and it's that for 400 pages and nothing happens, like a writer's novel where and it just moves you really deeply and makes you see life anew. And there's something alluring about that challenge. Like how much could I construct something that is just fully obliquely, like I'm not telling the reader what to think or feel, but I'm just constructing fully, trusting that I can construct a space of words and just descriptions of things, and that in itself will produce a rich and interesting and useful and enlightening experience for the reader. That if I could write that, I'll be proud, or
Hmm.
maybe prideful.
Who are some of the writers that you admire most that have done things like that or that you really looked up to in your own writing practice at this time?
So Thomas Tranströmer is obviously a big one. I keep his collected works here. Um, and I think Sebald wrote these books, which is that's he's just walking through like rural England or something and looking at things. That has also been important to me. I remember like another book I also have here that was important to me was with Knausgård's My Struggle. This is the last part. Uh, that was that was important to me, that book. So that book came out, I think maybe 2009 in Sweden or something like that. And and I was, the sort of funny fact is, well, I was living maybe 5 hours, 5 minutes away from where he was living when he wrote that book. So it was the first time I saw someone turn, or the only time I've ever seen someone turn my everyday experience, like the very streets that I walk on and like the exact type of pine forest that I would play in as a kid, and turn that into like literature of the highest order. So that was an important experience for me to see that like my lived reality could be elevated into literature. And I think he has that ability of um the deeper points that he makes in his books. So that I don't know if you've read it, but it's like 3,600 pages of him going on and on about mostly like things he's ashamed of. Um, so it's a very deeply honest and emotional book, but there's like so many interesting things that happens over those 3,000 pages in between the lines that I don't think he was aware of putting in there, but he's has this ability to create these larger resonances across the work. So those are two writers that was really informative for me early on. I've also sort of later Michael Nielsen is very important for me. He's a very different kind of writer, but also has a very different kind of writer. But I admire him a lot because of his humility as a writer. He's a very trying to write down what he's thinking very clearly, but he's very sort of willing to. He's not posing. It's not fake thinking. It's a lot of intellectual essays are just fake thinking. It's someone who's kind of thought something and maybe a writer or something, but then they construct it to make it look like a good argument or make themselves look smart. And he's not doing that. You really feel that he only cares about arriving at the truth, and he is really willing to sort of point out the flaws in his thinking and to sit with the ways he's dissatisfied with his explanations and sort of point out the open doors that he's not doing. And there's something about his way of writing that was very important to me too, of that really deep humility of like being willing to follow your curiosity and being willing to look stupid almost on the page. I mean, he doesn't look stupid at all, but um, that's the best way I can describe it. It has these, Michael Nielsen, he does these things sometimes in his writing. Well, he'll write this passage that to me just looks is amazing. It's super smart. It's like the best. And then he'll get to the end and I'll say, okay, there are 4 reasons why I am dissatisfied with this. Let me try to sit with that feeling and articulate why I think this is maybe not the right way of explaining this. And then he'll just like sit with that and like explain all the things that he's dissatisfied with what he just wrote. And that's such a gift, right? Because as a writer, then I get to see like someone who's really worked hard and who's really thought about these hard what are the limits he's going to and what is the kind of honesty and critique that he applies to himself and then I can look at that and try to model it. So that's been really important to me.
You have this passage where you talk about describing the internet to one of your daughters, and you describe it as an alien intelligence that we're just learning how to use. And I wonder how your experience of writing online has been and how that shapes how you show up to your work and your thinking. It is, it's dramatically different than it would have been a century ago, or, if you were Montaigne back in the day. I love Montaigne,
Mhm.
or Emerson. They weren't publishing on the internet. And I'm curious what your experience of that has been and how it changes the activity of writing and thinking for you.
Yeah, so yeah, that's been so important for me. So as I was talking about, like to sort of connect it back to the previous, like the problem with when I was in the literary world was that it was a sort of pre-existing context. And whenever you like go to a publisher or to a magazine, you're always there's a pre-existing audience and a pre-existing set of assumptions about what you can and cannot do. And it took me way too long to realize that the way out of that problem was by writing on the internet. So I spent many years barely on the internet at all, and that had its upsides. So I was maybe in some ways very skeptical of internet. Like felt that I was I couldn't see in what ways it could be useful. So I'm kind of mostly saying that as a context because now I'm a very internet optimistic person. Uh, and yeah, and it really changes what it is you do with writing. It becomes having a blog, like writing recurringly in the same space is a fundamentally different practice than writing just standoff essays or writing books or writing for publication because you are because if when you write traditionally the sort of unit of thought is the essay, whereas on a blog an essay is just um sort of the input into a larger process because the larger work of constructing it is again like a vehicle because like I've kind of gradually by putting out certain texts I've attracted people into my life and like we're having this conversation now which is changing me is changing you and that's because both of you and me and both of us have published things online and we've read each other's work and that creates this equation so the work so yes you wrote certain blog posts that you've written for themselves but you also at least if you're smart about it uh, put some thought into what kind of world am I shaping what kind of people am I pulling in and it becomes like this meta layer above it so and so you have to you and now I'm kind of yeah I kind of always try to think about that like how I sort of position myself in this in the network and how I'm shaping a network around me because that's such an important part of the work. But because by putting out certain types of pieces, attracting certain types of readers, and then I get feedback and book recommendations, or maybe I reach out to people. It's the same thing, and that changes who I am, changes my learning, changes what I can write. So it becomes this kind of auto catalytic process where it kind of feeds, and you have to sort of steer that and direct that. You can't just kind of blindly write and put things out because there's so many forces going on in that process. It can go really well, but I mean, you have things like audience capture, which is one of the fail modes, right? You put out things and you're not able to distinguish between like the good resonance that you get with the internet and the bad resonance you get. And then that process ends up destroying you or turning you into a caricature of yourself. So you have to develop some sort of sense of who you are, where you want to go, what the landscape on the internet looks like, and how to sort of put things out in such a way that you attract and shape the input you get back in a way that creates a larger whole. So yeah, it really adds this meta layer above, and it's again one of those things that is really hard to talk about in a succinct way because I bet for a lot of people who have not done this, this just sounds like almost like gibberish. Because, but it's just such almost tacit knowledge that you build up. Like I've been doing it like for 4 years now, and after a while, you start to almost feel this energetic. Like I can know, like if I write this way, it's gonna attract these types of comments, and if I go on Twitter, I can sort of in my body sort of feel the shape of the communities and I kind of know who knows who and I can sort of visualize how information flows in ways that I absolutely couldn't do 4 years ago. So you kind of just build up this almost feel for it. Just have to be in the practice of like trying things, reflecting on how did that make me feel? Did that make me feel more like me? Did that make me grow as a person toward the thing? And then you try things again, and gradually you build up this kind of know-how. And that's people who are extremely online have that feel, and then that's also like a big sort of um conversation. Like a lot of people who are not extremely online, they look at Twitter or something and say it's just horrible, it's shit, it's terrible things. And then some people say they love it and they can't understand each other. It's just because they have such different experiences, and it just takes a lot of expertise and so on to navigate that. I feel that was like an unsatisfying answer to your question, but
Oh, it's very satisfying. I felt very seen, and I understood myself better and felt a kinship in it. It may not have been satisfying to you, but it was to me. Yeah.
yeah, but it's always it's fun. I like this conversation that we're having right now here because there's something about how you ask questions and move your face while I talk that just makes me feel like very relaxed and letting go all of my like I'm not trying to entertain anyone here. I'm like not telling stories, and it's okay to go all the way to the edge where you risk decoherence. And that's very nice to create that space. Because I think that's so important. And I think you have a lot of that ethos. I know like in your book you talk about like this sharing your like what you learn publicly, and that's such a very important like in our parts of the internet. That's like an important ethos of like you learn things, you share it. But a very important part of that I feel like a lot of people miss is that decoherence, like allowing yourself to be caught in the act. Like what the example I gave earlier with Michael Nielsen, when he stops and says, I'm dissatisfied with this wasn't good enough, or explaining something and it ends up in nothing because you can't grasp the thing you're grasping for, and like also allowing that thing to exist on the sort of open web like so that people, because it's really, even though like most people will listen to a few of the answers I've given today and say I have no idea what he's talking about, like yeah, I don't either because I didn't get there, but like for maybe for some people listening to that will give some flavor of like how I arrive at the things that later on will sound clear, and realize that that's an important pre-step before you say things that sound clearly. So,
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely.
yeah, so thank you for creating the like feeling of safety where I feel like I can allow myself to sound stupid.
I'm so glad, and you don't sound stupid to me at all.
Good.
Uh, yeah, I love the space of really listening to someone and giving time to see it fleshed out. I think conversation and writing are different in that way, although mutually supportive. They feed into each other. Um, I'd love to ask about you link to Visa's post about being a serious person or serious people, and uh, I would describe you and your wife as serious people with respect to your marriage. And I wonder why that's the case. Why were you two serious about your marriage? Why do you think other people maybe aren't serious about marriage and in the way that you are? Obviously, your marriage is different in that you two are different people than other people. It's not that other people's marriage would have to look like yours specifically or value the same things, but the seriousness I think is quite important. And I wonder why your marriage, why you two were serious about it.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny like because when you live your life it feels it's so obvious to do it the way you do it. And one of the privileges of having a blog and like getting exposed like is that I get so many people who write to me, and in particular like a lot of people who write to me about like their relationship problems. Uh and and it's so fascinating because you realize like I'm like I'm not standard. I'm not normal, but there's so many ways of doing this and so many like ways that people seem to trap themselves in like a certain way, or that seems like traps because it seems to me like it's keeping them from what they were looking for. Uh, and I just don't understand, like, why would you do that? Like, I don't understand. So it's what getting at is it's hard to understand. Like, it just feels like the thing you're supposed to do, and why would you do it any other way? Um, it just feels obvious to me that like if you have a relationship and then you would want it to be an amazing relationship or like be the best version of what you two can be together as possible. Like why, like my wife always says, like why would you ever want to do something not the best you can? Uh, that doesn't make sense. Like you're gonna have to do it anyway. Um, well, it does make sense to some extent because of opportunity costs. It means that we've had to give up other things to develop a relationship. But I've always been the type of person who, no, that's not true. But I've gradually become more and more of the type of person who likes to do few things and do them well because I think there's just something different, something so different about like when you get to level 100 of writing or of a relationship compared to just like having a lot of more superficial experiences. And that means I'm very willing to try to push the few things I care about along. But why do I end up being a person like that? Again, like overdetermined. I like in my family there are like in my like extended family no divorces. Like everyone has a good relationship in my extended family. That's just so there's like something in the culture like that I probably got with me from home and from my extended family of just put in the effort and work into making a strong relationship. That probably helped. I think I was helped to some extent by like in my early 20s when I was in the literary world. That was a very sort of queer feminist kind of world, and I have some qualms with that philosophy, but I also think it helped in that this sense because there was this idea of sort of deconstruction of like taking apart what a relationship is and could be and like kind of reasoning up from first principles in each case. And I think that like gave me perhaps like a good framework once I like met my wife, and where I the sort of normal cultural way in the scene I was in was to not let, because I think the mistake a lot of people do is they kind of go in with assumptions around what a relationship should be, and um then they kind of get stuck in all these problems and to make a really serious deep relationship you have to look at it clearly and like see what is this person and what are our interaction and what are their limitations and frustrations and problems we have and like construct I'm talking about vehicles all day today, but like, yeah, it's your like the relationship is the first, like, it's two people, but you're constructing something around yourself, and and for that to be a good relationship, you have to construct something that fits these two people, and that will look fundamentally different, or not fundamentally different, but it will look subtly different for all people. And I think a lot of like normal romantic discourse is centered around these like almost set roles where you're playing like the boyfriend character and the girlfriend character, and there's variations on that, but I think it helped to have this idea that this is going to be like a handmade relationship. Like all relationships are supposed to be handmade. You're supposed to not take anything for granted. Like there was like when once we started hanging out, there was never any of those expectations like, oh, so now we're hanging, so we you can expect that I will call you, or like we sort of negotiated everything in our relationships. Like every single step along the way was kind of negotiated and thought through because that was how you did it, like in those queer circles. And I think that was probably a good thing and set up like a healthy dynamic where the relationship was seen as a constructed thing, a project that you worked on. So that's my guess that those two things sort of in combination with like genetics and personality put us in a good place to construct a strong relationship.
It's such a tremendous blessing, and I'm so happy for you and your family when I hear you talk about that or read you write about it. Um,
Yeah, it
I
is. It is.
I find myself curious about how you collaborate with your wife on your writing and your blog, and you talk about this at a few points, but I'm curious how you would describe that aspect of your relationship.
Yeah, that's very hard. That's really like love in hard mode. It's not easy. We've been doing it like to and fro for I don't know, 12 years now. But there's like always been like times where I retreat a little bit and I write secretly because it can be it's very easy to wound someone like when you come with a draft of your half finished thoughts, and it's really easy to step on each other's toes in a situation like that. So it's been a hard process, but we've we've been have had these kind of backs and forths like, but we've really over time built up a lot of deep trust in this process. And I think that's also one of these things that are good for relationships. Yes, it's really hard, but hard things are good in relationships as long as you can handle them, because it kind of forces you to surface feelings and thoughts and conflicts. I think the project has been really a place of growth for our relationship. But now we're at this point where we're extremely brutal with each other. It's like I joke a lot about like um that like there's sometimes people will email me and ask if they can hire my wife as an editor because they know she's my editor, and I was like you don't want that because she would destroy you because she really goes she's just so a lot of the time what happens is that I mean, a lot of the work is just us talking, and she's just like ruthlessly like attacking all the weak points in my arguments and like pointing out the flaws, and we're talking and talking. So a lot of that's just talking, and in conversation that's quite easy. And then I'll write a draft and I'll give it to her, and then she'll be like sitting in bed with a draft, and she'll be like that with like a serious face on for like 3 hours sometimes. Like sometimes it takes her longer to read it than it takes for me to write it because she's an intensely present person, and she'll you do that thing where she stops like every time there's like a word that feels off to her, she'll just stop and sit there for like 15 minutes and like fully feel like why do I not like this word, and then write a long explanation of like or a counterexample or something. So there's a lot of that where she um yeah, just kind of tries to look for the flaws in what I'm doing in a like very demanding and deep way. And then over time I get better because I learn how to model what she sees in my head. And that's a lot of how I've gotten become a better writer because I apply the same kind of rigor at what I'm writing. But she's also really good at because she has like no ego at all. She I struggle with that a lot more than she does. So I will, sometimes feel like, oh, I need to write like people will not like this, or no, we can't write it like that because it's too boring. And she's like, yeah, well, the boring version is more true, so we'll do the boring version. And she's got this, and that, so she's always trying to sort of remove all the things that I do to make a piece look exciting or smart, and like focus on like, but this is the important part, like. So I remember, for example, I had a draft 2 years ago where I was talking about like identities as interfaces, and I thought that was such a clever way of like applying like interface theory to talk about identities, and you could see a lot of deep things in that. And she looked at that draft and a long draft, and then kind of she circled one sentence where I just kind of mentioned the importance of solitude, of just like being on your own. And she's like, that's the actually important idea here. Like the rest of it is just you trying to look smart. The important thing is like taking time and be and I'm like, yeah, but everyone knows that. Like, yeah, go into the woods and like sit with your no, but like everyone, that's a boring idea. Everyone knows that. Yeah, but that's the true idea. That's the more important idea. The rest is noise. The rest is covering up this more important idea and doesn't you'll have to figure out some way of making that truth shine. And so she has this way of going to like, yeah, this is a banal truth, but this is the deeper truth, and let's cut away the things that cover over the deeper truth. So that's a lot of the shape of our conversation. And then obviously we kind of work on projects together. We raise kids, we have the garden, we discuss things, and that's kind of the breeding ground for the ideas. But yeah, her role is to just prune everything down and like remove things I do from ego or things that I haven't thought fully through and like trying to cut away to like simple core of it.
Hmm. It's good to have an editor like that. I'm glad you do. Uh,
Yeah, it's yeah, it's a tremendous privilege. And again, like as I said, like I get a lot of emails from people like talking about their relationship or their relationship problems. And a lot of people are lonely. They're 30 years old, they've never dated anyone. And then you realize, oh my like oh my God, I'm so lucky, because and it's so easy, like before I started getting all those emails to think like yeah, I'm such a smart guy, like I'm talented smart guy, like I've got things figured out, like I've worked hard. And that's true, like I've worked hard for the things I have. But once you see like the situations other people are in, like they didn't have parents who loved them, they never had someone who listened to them, who told them to like get their shit together and do the right thing, then you realize, oh, oh God, I have so much, so many people to thank for what I've done. And like a very small part of it was actually me, like I made a difference. I played the hand I had as well as I could, but yeah, there's the humility and realizing how much you depend on the care of others and how many people do not get that.
well, we've covered so much territory. I wonder if there's anything else that you'd like to talk more about or dive more deeply into.
Yeah, I was looking at your book because you have a book about curiosity. You've written several books, but the one that obviously is, and I guess like many of your books overlap a lot with what I'm interested in and doing. But could you talk a little bit about like why? Because you also have like a tattoo that symbolizes
I do.
curiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a
Uh,
sweatshirt on, so but yeah, there you can see it. It's this.
yeah. Um, can you talk to why did you do that and why that matters so much to you?
Why did I tattoo curiosity to my arm?
Yeah. Like, or, I mean, like, not the tattoo so much, but like what it symbolizes to you and like why it matters enough to go
Hmm.
through that.
I remember one of my mentors, Miss Prince, she had a tattoo, and I thought that was so cool. And I thought about, oh, should I get a tattoo? And I wanted to have a tattoo that really meant something to me, something that I would be confident that no matter how I changed or what seasons of life there were, that I would be like, yeah, I still stand by that. And I really couldn't think of something at the time. I was like maybe 19 or 20 that I was
Mm.
like, yeah, I feel really confident that no matter what, I'm gonna really want to stand by this. Um, and then shortly after, I have this piece I wrote called "The Day I Was Born" that was about, you know, sort of you could see it as the beginning of Act Two of my life. And that's been a helpful frame for me to look at people in terms of having acts of their lives and chapters. And I think you and I are both in act two, from
Mhm.
that frame. And
What does Act Two signify to you?
that you know who you are and who you're not, and then you can go about trying to do that with the rest of your life. I think Act One is very much about discovering who you are and what your values are and what your gifts are, and messing up and making mistakes and maybe being in the wrong context for a time, like growing through not the perfect situation or something, and then once you come to some clarity of this is who I am and what I want and what I want to do with my life, then you're like, okay, I will set about doing that now. And then I suspect that there will be an act three, which is like some kind, I mean, we'll see what that's like, but some kind of maturation of that where you see it from a higher level and probably are operating at a bigger scale as well, where you're influencing more people, connected to more people, but at a deeper way, but maybe more concerned with legacy or something like that. But yeah, act two. Um, and
So I
so
was
it,
asking about curiosity.
yeah, yeah. At that stage when I transitioned to Act Two, I had the idea of my tattoo on my left arm, which is for love, to get one for Brahma Viharas, and I got that. And then as I became clear about each of the parts of my life's work, which I frame as love, curiosity, empowerment, now I wanted a tattoo for each of them. And the curiosity one has come to mean two things, I think. Broadly following my curiosity where it leads, which you write about that's, been such a priority for you and your wife and in your marriage. And I love that. I do really feel a kinship in that. Um, and then it's also meant being willing to ask every question that I'm curious about. Often when a question comes to my mind, it might be uh, vulnerable to ask. Maybe it's sort of edgy to ask, or I'm concerned about how someone else will receive it. Or sometimes it's just a strange question. A lot of the questions I love so much are ones that I'd never heard anyone else ask, or they emerge from a very specific context or conversation. I'm like, wait, I think I need to ask you this really weird thought experiment. What do you think about this? And that's always the question that changes my life and changes someone else's views and changes the world really. And so it's sort of a commitment in advance to ask those questions and to see where it leads. And yeah, broadly to keep learning and growing and diving into the things that I find that I'm curious about.
At what age did you transition to Act Two?
It was 2021, so I would have been 30. Yeah. I was just before 30, actually. I would have been 29 just before my birthday.
Do you think, um, can you imagine a life where you transitioned into Act Two at 25? Is that possible, or is it like an uncompressible experience?
I mean, in some ways, the last 3 or 4 years leading up to that moment were the transition into Act Two. It depends where you divide it up, but that day was such a obvious state shift. And before and after, I write about what I call this messenger role. I mean, it's sort of through the metaphor of a role-playing game. But in my 20s, I was like LARPing being a monk, basically, and uh, learning what that was like. And that was good. That was very good. That's what I needed to do in my 20s. But I'm not a monk now. I call myself a pilgrim, and I sort of shifted classes, as it were, into a messenger role. And specific messages came to me on that day that I've tried to live my life by since then. And they were almost like a scripture for me that came to me. And it wasn't the Bible, and it wasn't a Buddhist text, and it wasn't a Taoist text. It was like something that was just for me. And I've shared it since in case it resonates with other people, or I've shared parts of it. Uh, but that was just such a obvious state shift. Like, yeah, maybe it could happen differently for someone else, but that's the way it happened for me.
How did you like? How did that the clarity arrive to you, like specifically?
Yeah, that day I took MDMA and I wrote about it, and I'd taken it earlier in my life, and it was kind of like a non-effect. But I think that yes, it was a substance, but it was also a result of all of the work that I'd done in my 20s and all of the training I'd done. And the dead ends I'd gone down and the mistakes I'd made, and it sort of was a crystallized shift coming from all of that work.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that definitely seems to be the case with psychedelics and other things like that. It's a space you can go into, but it depends on what you bring into it and what you do in that space. Um, as with everything, I guess.
Hmm.
So before you had your monk period, you was at a classics college, sang St. John?
That's right. Yep, that was a big part of my. At a certain point when I was at the monastery, I realized, oh, that was a form of training. Like going to St. John's was doing that for 4 years. I did it very intensely. I really threw myself in and made the most of that experience. And uh, yeah, that was a form of training and a form of training and curiosity, I think, and one that was has been so essential to my writing and my reading and my learning and growth since then, especially. I sort of put that direction on pause in a lot of ways when I was at the monastery, went a very different road.
And so St. John's, that's mostly diving deep into the Western canon.
Yeah, I
As
remember really clearly that when I went there at the beginning, I had this very like ego idea of, oh, I'm gonna be a person who's read all these books and I'm gonna have read those books and those are the important books. And I still think about some of those books sometimes. They are important, but what I learned there was much more a way of learning and reading and writing and asking questions, having conversations, and that's been so much 1,000 times more important than any particular book I read or idea I
Mhm.
was exposed to. They almost are, it's like laughable to think that the books were the important part. They were the occasion for that kind of work to be done.
Yeah. No, I think that a lot. I think I don't remember who said it, but there was a few months back. Like some people were going through Aristotle with ChatGPT and like getting summaries and like talking about how much better it was because it was so much clearer. And that just totally misses the point with reading Aristotle because it's like many of the ideas have been improved upon, but like what he embodies is the way of moving through an idea space and like a way of asking questions and a way of like doubting himself and so on. Like all of those things are, and all of that gets, of course, stripped that way if when you do those AI summaries that people were reading. And so the good thing you get take away because when you read Aristotle is like modeling a certain way of thinking and also in your context you will probably do like something like Socratic dialogues or something around the text as well with other students so there are all these other things that are actually sort of the thing that are reshaping your nervous system um but was it like so there you went into the Western canon and then there was more the Eastern like Buddhist texts that we were looking at the monastery.
We did end up reading those, and I read some of those on my own. They were trying to do a sort of, still are trying to do a form of Western Buddhism that is, works for people in our time and our culture. And that was important to me because I was a middle class suburban American and I was like, oh, I can't go to a Japanese monastery or a Thai monastery or something. I would just break culturally. It wouldn't work for me, no matter how much respect I might have for those traditions. Yeah.
But do you feel, I guess, where you're now, like, do you feel where you're now in your life, do you feel closer to like the Eastern traditions or to the Western traditions? Like, where do you feel now? Or is that like a not even a meaningful
Hmm.
question?
No, it's a meaningful question. I'm amused at it. The answer that comes to mind is I'm in having this conversation in New Mexico, in Santa Fe, and that feels right. I've really come to love New Mexico this year, and I'm sort of doing my own thing. I have been inspired by both of those traditions, but I'm trying to be, zooming out. Sometimes I find it helpful to think of my life as like what I really am is a life artist. And I'm, sure I interview people on my podcast, or sure I write blog posts, or sure I write novels, or I make music now, or I do this, or I do that. There's a lot of different things I do. I make visual art. I tweet a lot. Um, but I'm not a musician. I'm not a visual artist. I'm not a novelist. I'm a life artist, and my life is the piece of art. And so I'm trying to be true to who I am and what I know and what my values are. And those are influenced by all of the things that I've been exposed to. But the way I'm living my life now is not something that anyone specifically told me from any tradition. It's like it's an emergent property of having been exposed to those things. And
Hmm.
I'm like, oh, this makes much more sense. No one told me that. Like for a simple example would be I've started writing novels over the last 4 years, little short novellas. They're not very long, and those have been so rich spiritually. I feel like they're really almost like magic. They're a spell that transforms me and my world and has impacts on other people and that read them. And nobody, my spiritual teacher certainly never told me, "Oh, Tasshin, go write novels. Like you need to write novels. That's going to be important for you in your spiritual growth." But like from where I'm standing, it's like that's a thing that needs to happen. And is it the thing? No. Like I'm not going to be just a novelist. I think you and I differ in this respect a little bit. I've been thinking a fair bit about this, generally speaking, about approaches to excellence and competence. And you said in this conversation, "Oh, I'd like to be." I'm paraphrasing here, but basically excellent at a few things of my own choosing. And I really respect that. That makes so much sense. And it's a tried and true path. Like pick one or two things and be really good at them. And you want to be a really good dad, you want to be a really good husband, and you want to be a really good writer. And that matters. You want to follow your curiosity through your writing. Um, I really love being kind of good at a lot of different things. Like I'm never going to be the best at any of the one things that I do, but you can kind of get surprisingly competent at a lot of different things if you're the thing that's important to me is that I have fun while I'm doing it. It's enjoyable, and it's generative. As long as it's fun, I'm willing to keep going. And I don't need to be the best in the world. I'd rather be like pretty good, surprisingly good, but not
Hmm.
excellent at a lot of different things, and then see how those support and feed into each other.
Yeah. No, I resonate with that a lot. I think I think I don't use the term life artist, but I think I resonate with that project of that some kind of Emersonian sense that like there's something that wants to happen through me, and my job is to sort of pay attention to that and let that unfold. And that's partially self-expression, but it's also importantly like my kids are something that gets born through me, and my marriage and the people I care for. And so this kind of unfolding, and I've definitely had like periods which are more like what you're describing now. Like I have had periods where I was programming and doing math and playing in bands and writing and doing novels and like I had all of that. And I think the way I tend to visualize it is almost like a possibility space. There's this kind of foggy landscape of life that I could be moving through, and there's gonna be and my job is to move through that foggy landscape to the peaks or whatever to find the rich, deep experiences that could potentially happen through me. And going like doing a deep search or a broad search, those are just different techniques for the same underlying problem. And like for act one for me, broad search. Now I'm in a like going small because I feel like the things I find right now by going deep are like higher value, more interesting than the things I get by going broad. But I also sort of assume there will be a point, maybe 5 years from now, where will have exhausted writing, for example, and will want to go into like make opera or I'll explode outwards again. So I don't think of myself as like being a broad or a narrow person, as more someone who tries to be somewhat thoughtful about like where I want to be in the current cycle of my life,
Hmm,
if that makes
that's really
sense.
well said. Yeah, both that there's yeah, broad versus deep, and then the seasons of it and the time of it.
Hmm.
I think that's really astute. Uh, and I can't help but say that I hope that if that comes to pass, that you write some fiction someday, because I would love, I know you did in the past, but I would really love to see some more fiction from you, and
Yeah.
especially after having done all of this work and this building these skills.
No, I could see like yeah, because we emailed about this before if I was
Hmm.
gonna write fiction, but thinking about it more, like I can imagine a future where that makes sense because there's certain so like the trajectory I've been on recently is to go more towards storytelling, more towards sort of felt narratives in my essays. And there's definitely like some certain areas that I can't reach with the current method. Like there's certain things that would be too insensitive to write about because it would hurt people I love or it would be too shameful for me to write about. Like there's certain topics and areas that are without that I couldn't reach where it might be natural to sort of transition into to writing fiction to reach some deeper, more painful places. So we'll see.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
You wrote your thesis or something like that at St. John's on Plato's Phaedrus.
I did, yeah.
Um, is that so long ago you don't remember at all? But or do you remember sort of what your takeaway from that was?
It's funny that you asked. Well, one, I'm flattered that you asked because, yeah, thanks for reading some of my stuff. But also, I thought about it recently in a way that's not unlike how we've been talking in that that article that you wrote about your wife as your editor, and she's saying like, "What do you really care about here?" I think reading that made me think about that essay, and um, I was trying so hard. There was an annual essay contest at St. John's, and I really wanted to win the annual essay contest every year. I never did, and I was trying so hard to win it and like write the thing that I thought would win the essay and the contest, and but by that time, I really also did care about the Phaedrus. There was something about the character of Phaedrus and that dialogue in particular that just really spoke to me. I had this idea that Plato wrote different dialogues for different kinds of souls, and that different ones would speak to different kinds of people. And that was the one that really spoke to me. So I was like, okay, I should dive into this. And, Phaedrus as a person is someone who loves he loves the sophists and writing and music and things that sound pretty and cares less about truth. And that's a character flaw that I certainly have and recognized at the time. And uh, but I think it might be worth doing this, but I think I could go back and look at that essay and probably say in a paragraph or two what I was really trying to say and what I really cared about, and that would be a better essay than the one that I wrote as beautiful. As a beautiful. I really tried hard with that essay. I it wasn't for naught, but it's not like it was worthless or something. But I think it would be an even better essay if I just said in one or two or five paragraphs, this is what I thought about the book, and almost more of a book review, you know? This is what I
Hmm.
think this dialogue is about and how it impacted me, and kept it very simple. And I think that would be a more honest and excellent essay. Yeah. I cared
Yeah.
about self-knowledge. It was all about self-knowledge and uh, whether Socrates really knew Phaedrus and whether Phaedrus really knew himself and whether Socrates knew himself. And um, in a lot of ways, the act one for me was about self-knowledge. It was like, who am I and who am I not? And in what ways am I like my mentors, or do I care about what they care about? In what ways do I not? And I think yeah, I think I know myself much better than I did then. And it took 30 years to kind of have a sense of, ah, yes, this is who I am. And importantly, this is who I'm not. I'm just not going to be that person. I'm going to be this person instead.
Do you have role models these days? Do you have like people that you like you look at them and like, oh yeah, now I remember that thing is important.
Hmm.
Do you have
Well, a
people
big
like
one
that?
recently has been this writer, Henrik Karlsson. He's great. But I really try. So I'll say two things about that. I have a practice of trying to receive each person that I am with as my spiritual teacher. So right now you are my teacher, and what that
Mhm.
means to me is I'm trying to be willing to learn from you and grow through what you say, even indirectly. And then also in a flip way, uh, symmetrically, to be willing to offer something that's of help or service if it's wanted, needed, requested. That one I can't control. Like it's like I just have to be willing, but I can control whether I'm listening to someone or digesting what they say or incorporating it or taking what it moves in me and acting on that. So I really do experience everyone as a teacher to me and as a role model. And you certainly, I've loved reading your writing and this conversation. Um, it's not just facetious, but I will say a big one has been Peace Pilgrim. She's really come to be. I never met her, but I've read her writings extensively, and she's just become a huge inspiration for me. If anything, more so than the Buddha, which is really saying a lot because the Buddha was such a big influence on me. Um, because I think it's important that she's much, much closer chronologically and also culturally. She was an American woman. She wrote, she was probably born in the 30s or something like that, and died in 81 or the 80s sometime, I think. And so much, much closer to me than the Buddha, who was 2,600 years ago in India, which is a totally different place and culture. Um, yeah, and her teachings have been very clear and how to act on them in my own life. She's been a big hero. I was in Singapore last month and I got to see Visa. He's a friend and hero. Um, uh, yeah, lots of other people, but those are some that I'll mention.
It's really interesting the thing you say about treating everyone as a teacher. I that's something I think about a lot too. I use different framings, but like one of the frames that I use is for a similar idea is that like never assume that you can fit another person into your head, that
Hmm.
there's always an outside, there's always something that you're not seeing. And I think that does sort of the same thing for me than that what you're saying does for you, is that by sort of orienting toward that edge, the thing that that person has in them that is beyond you, that you do not yet understand or model, that is a deep learning experience. And I'm always, again, I think this is goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like privilege, that I'm so like I feel very privileged for like my parents and my wife. And I think maybe both and you and I should feel very privileged about like having the capacity to treat people like this, because it's such a gift. And I see so many people, like through my writing, many people that I meet feel lonely. And there's like, and if you go on Twitter, there's so much like discourse about like how hard it is to date, or how hard it, like how boring everyone is. And I just can't relate. Like you just talk to anyone. Like there's like I can I'll just go, like people write about this, like you can't find friends, and I'll just go down to the grocery store, and like the first person I start talking to is like turns out to be like a Japanese linguist, and then he's explaining like printmaking in 1800s Japan. Right, it's super interesting. Like they were everywhere. Everyone is like filled with these treasures, and I kind of, so many people struggle to see that, and I think that's maybe before I used to think of that as something like, well, you know, why are you not looking? Just look at people around you, like why are you so dissatisfied? But now I think it's something about how you're wired. Like it's some people struggle with doing that for some reason, and it's like it's not their fault, and it's such a privilege to be a person who does not struggle with that. Um, I want to dive into like one last part of your biography, which I thought was funny, was that you were at the monastery, but you were reading military strategy, which I I don't know what my question is here, but you kind of mentioned that briefly in some of your writing, but I just um want a little bit of more of the felt experience of that. Like, so why? What do you think it says about you that both of those things resonated at you in you and at the same time? And how did it feel to be in that context, reading about military strategy and like the interactions with other people at the time,
Hmm.
um, at the monastery?
I will answer that. I'm going to zoom out and say that I have found it so useful to view people, certainly myself, but also other people, as almost like this living, breathing question that we're asking a question with our lives. And I sort of asked you at this at the beginning, what are the questions that have been motivating you through your life? And um, I think the biggest question that I've been asking with my life is what does it mean to be a good person? How can I be a good person? And asking that question from a place of not knowing what it means to be a good person or even what the universe is or why we're alive. Like that's implicit in that question for me. And being interested in something like certainly a monastery or meditation training is part of trying to answer that question, and so was military strategy. I've always been a pacifist. I have taken the five precepts, so hopefully I wouldn't kill someone or harm someone, but I had no interest in military strategy for the sake of, you know, learning how to have more violence or something. Although the best strategists actually want less violence, like the Taoist strategists, they're like, yeah, let's end war as soon as possible. Let's get out of this. War is bad for humanity. So how do we wage war in a way that makes less people die and makes war end sooner? But um, but yeah, I had questions of at the time, certainly the monastery that I was at involved training and leadership through running a nonprofit. And I was like, how do we actually succeed at the thing we're trying to do? How do we coordinate together as a team? How do we work effectively with other people who are trying to do similar things? That was not obvious at all to me in my real situation with real people and real other organizations. And then in retrospect, I think I was kind of, I like poetic ways of putting things. So I'm going to put it a poetic, metaphorical way, even if it's not strictly true. But you be the judge. But I think I was being prepared for what I'm doing now and what my soul was asking me to do. And the project that I'm on now of creating what I call the Service Guild, I just absolutely couldn't have done that without having read obsessively about military strategy for a few years and learning how teams work and how to coordinate with people. I was at kind of at my peak limit of being able to act by myself and like write things by myself or do things by myself. And I needed to learn how to work with other people and how to lead a team and how to coordinate people. And also importantly, how to build mutually supportive feedback loops between different aspects of projects and people and time and effort. And the Service Guild is basically a very intentionally constructed, mutually supportive feedback loop between the people that are in it and the three endeavors of love, curiosity, and empowerment. And uh, hopefully, in time, we'll have other departments as well. And uh, I don't know. It's basically a bet that the what I learned about strategy will apply to these domains, and we'll see how it pans out in the end.
Yeah, that's always such an interesting sort of surprise when you discover that the sort of random puzzle pieces you're picking up fit together later on, and then you can be sort of open-minded. But when you're a searching person, as you were, as I was, um, there can be a certain amount of frustration, or I did feel a lot of frustration and fear and in that process of picking up the puzzle pieces, because a lot of other people were just like they knew what puzzle they were building, and they were collecting the right puzzle pieces, and I was just collecting random puzzle pieces. Um, and then but the good thing, I guess, is that the puzzle pieces, when you pick them randomly, you pick them because they fit you. Uh, and so then once you get like enough, you like the and it's if I guess like to some extent like now I'm being so super rationalist, not poetic about it. Like once you get enough puzzle pieces, you're going to be able to make something. And if all of the puzzle pieces you have fit you, you're going to be able to make something that fits you, and that's going to be really nice. Um, and yeah, definitely feel that too. Like, just really random. Like, so I did, and how everything kind of fits together now. Like, I've been running businesses, and I've been editing and writing and doing poetry, and I've been, doing mathematics, and I'm pulling on all those things. But I also, I've been teaching, and I did translation work. And now I write in English. So it's like all of these super random things that didn't add up are just like I'm pulling almost all of it now. Um, and I wish I would have had more trust in that once you get enough puzzle pieces, you can build something with it. It's just that's almost inevitable.
You keep using this word random, and I notice when you say it that that word doesn't feel quite right to me. I've certainly used that word in this context before, but the words that come up for me instead are something like um, non-obvious or mysterious, where it's
Mhm.
like it's unclear how it fits with everything else. And certainly when I was at the monastery of military strategy, other people were like, "Why are you reading that? That what's up with that? No one else was reading it." But it was so clear to me that that was important, and it was resonant for me, even if it wasn't um, obvious how it fit with everything else or where it was going. Um, and I don't think it hasn't felt arbitrary to me. It hasn't felt meaningless or just happenstance or
Yeah.
it's felt like it's building up
No,
to something.
yeah, I agree. That's a good point. And I think this kind of points back to the thing we were talking about earlier. Like you articulate something and there's something slightly off with it. Because if you look at my previous answer, I used two different metaphors, and the one was random, which is I agree that's wrong. The other metaphor I used was you pick puzzle pieces that fit you, but they don't fit with each other, right?
Yes,
Um,
that
so,
one
so,
very
so,
resonant. That one.
so that's a better image than random. Yeah, it's true. You're picking puzzle pieces
Well,
that do
random gets
not.
something of it. It's not wrong either because it there is a weirdness to it or an oddness or a surprisingness to it
Yeah,
or
yeah,
an
but you're picking puzzle
unexpectedness.
pieces that do not fit each other.
Yeah.
That's
And
what
you're
it
like, this
that's
definitely I don't see. Yeah, no.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so that's
Huh. Well, I think that I'm always curious about this sort of thing with people, but having read a fair bit of your work and having had this conversation, I find myself so curious about how the rest of Act Two and eventually, hopefully, God willing, Act Three will evolve. I think I see so much power and potential and direction, and it's when you keep doing that for years and decades, it's like, oh, it's a good piece of life art, yeah, that you're making.
yeah. No, it's such an interesting experience. And once you've done it long enough, like as we're talking about, like with frustration limitations, like you start thinking about that because you start to see it as this giant sort of unfolding. It's almost like you're reading a novel, and there's going to be challenges and problems. But I'm just really interested, as you say, like what will happen if I keep applying this process iteratively again and again for another 50 years? Where do we end up? And I guess that's also one of the big privileges of life is knowing that there's like empirically this has led to interesting, surprising places before. I have no idea, but I know if I apply this rule, I'm gonna be really surprised 10 years down the line and say like, how did this happen?
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, it's such a beautiful experience.
Hmm. Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you for taking the time to share some of it with me and the world and sort of document it in media res and show what it's like in the middle of it. I really experience it as such a gift to get to spend time with someone and see how they live and how they think and what they care about. So I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really an unfolding in
Mm.
real time here. So I'm so grateful that you listened to me and also for sharing your mind here at the end. So thank you.
Absolute pleasure.